Hello, and welcome to Resolve, an after-play show. This is an after-show for a role-playing game that does not have an actual play, where we tell you all the details of our game so you don't have to listen to it. I'm Sammie, and I'll be your host. My pronouns are she, her, and joining me is my wonderful co-host, Alex.
Hi, I'm Alex, and I use he, him pronouns.
And for this special introduction, we are joined by Daniel.
Hi, my name is Daniel. My pronouns are he, him, and I am the game master for this campaign.
Alright, so before we get into the details of who and what the Game Master is and does, let's talk a bit about you. Tell us about yourself and your history with role-playing games there, Daniel.
The first role-playing game that I played, I think, was Vampire the Masquerade with you, Sammie. This was, oh boy, about at least 5 years ago. It was what my friends were doing. You had convinced me tooth and nail to join in and check it out. I didn't really have much of a perception of role-playing games before that. I heard that people rolled dice, and that was pretty much it. And, told stories. I had no clue about what the specifics of role-playing games were. Yeah, ever since it's been something that I've been a lot more interested in. My friend from high school, we reconnected in college, and they showed me some D&D one-shots as well. That was all about around at a similar time. The following years, there was a couple more campaigns. Sammie, you and I played together in one, and then Alex, you GM'd Interstitial very recently for Sammie and I, and then Sammie, you again ran Vampire not long afterwards. Well, I had exclusively been a player up till that point. During these last few campaigns that I was playing, I got more and more ideas of what it would be to actually run a game. Also, I saw that Alex and Sammie seemed to be writing a lot of games recently. I was like, maybe it'd be interesting to allow them to both have a chance of being players as well. That sort of got me motivated into looking more into GMing and actually running a campaign of my own.
So you told us a little bit about your connection to the two of us through role-playing, but how do you know us maybe outside of that, and how do you know the rest of your players?
Sammie, you are my partner, IRL. Alex, I first met you at a party that was at Sammie's place.
Was that at a Halloween party, maybe?
Probably a Halloween party.
Besides you guys, I think I've known Carolyn the longest. Carolyn I met through sort of friend functions with Sammie. I did a tabletop game with Carolyn around 2017, 2018-ish. Carolyn was hilarious as a fellow player. They always inject that sort of humor into what they do, and it makes it very fun and engaging. With you, Alex, I met Zach through you, and I think you guys are both together at the Halloween party. Dee and Dex, I both met them the first time in the Interstitial campaign that you ran, Alex. I would go on to play with Dee as a fellow player in a VTM campaign that Sammie ran. Dee's great. I basically witnessed their sort of introduction to tabletop games. I've really seen them find what they like to do in terms of making characters, telling stories, doing the writing to express yourself creatively. It's been great watching that unfold, because I remember going through a very similar thing. I played alongside Dex in the first Interstitial game that I was playing in. They're amazing. They have such a great knack for very lovable characters. I'm super, super, super grateful that they were able to get the time to be able to play in the Interstitial campaign that I'm running currently.
This is your first time DMing, correct?
Absolutely. I have had zero prior experience.
What made you sort of take the plunge into writing your own campaign and wanting to fill the high throne of the Game Master?
Outside of actually playing tabletop games, I do like coming up with new characters. Character-centric storytelling is certainly one of my favorites. I just sort of grown into the habit of daydreaming, having intrusive thoughts, whatever you have it, just thinking about concepts for characters. Then those characters started to connect in World of Swords. That sort of process of coming up with little pieces to add on to a collective group motivated me to think, oh, this is starting to sound like I'm having ideas for something that could be a campaign, something that I started to grow more familiar with the concept of what a GM has to do, what it's like to set up and run a campaign. I kind of learned more and more about it. I felt like I wanted to be the person who facilitated that experience for others. Obviously, there was a lot to learn going into it, but so far it's been very rewarding, very much along the lines of what I had hoped for.
Is there anything that you're taking from being a former player into the perspective of being the GM?
I don't think it's possible for me not to take pretty much all of that I learned of being a player into being a GM, because that's the only experience that I had before. If I'm to name a few specifics, I definitely want to put a big emphasis on individual players' background as one part of it. Also, arc maybe, or idea that you had in mind. This is a collective storytelling experience. What I've taken as a player is the notion that having a character arc, having an involved storyline, something that's really impactful, something that's really impacted by your character is super, super important.
This is likely going to be the first episode of the podcast, but you have a couple sessions under your belt here where this is sort of a retroactive post. Do you feel yourself developing any sort of GM style? Do you have any practices you feel settled in by now?
I've learned a lot about what works and what doesn't with the preparation. You know, what's kind of extreme about this campaign's setup is that, one, we have a above average number of players, and we also had a really long phase of prep time. Obviously, I overthought a few things, at least for what we are playing. It does not nearly need to be as complicated as I originally thought. And the second is pacing. I personally am very comfortable with a slow burn, but you start to look back and see, oh, if you just put it down on paper, it's not a lot necessarily happened, even though it was very, very immersive. It was what I like to call a literary style pacing. What I've been playing around with is alternate forms of pacing.
Obviously, we can't ask you everything that's going to happen since we're still playing the game, but can you give us a couple of themes, concepts, other media that you've taken into account that's inspired the story that you've crafted?
Science fiction is one of my favorite genres, especially some of the classic science fiction elements I find very, very appealing. I drew from some things that are like MacGuffin tropey sort of stuff. I feel like that's all right when handled the right way. They're there for a reason. I would say my favorite combination of genres would be science fiction fantasy, where those sort of higher fantasy elements can be neatly blended in. Think of Dune. Think of Bionicle, one of my favorite themes to exist. That sort of blending of things that are absolutely not understood with technology that might seem like magic to us living in the present is something that really excites me. Other than that, it comes down to tones. I like a lot of deeper tones for stories. I like dramatic elements to them, highs and lows to be combined together. That all sort of blends itself together into what I have tried to put in place for this campaign.
Are there any fun facts about you that you'd like to share, Dan?
I am a scientist. I research heliophysics, and my work is involving in situ observations of the solar wind. One of the most recent things that we potentially found evidence for is the fact that neon, which is a gas, behaves a lot like magnesium, which is a metal in the solar wind. Neon has metallic properties. It could partly be due to how it's a noble gas, but it could also be due to a couple other factors, like how readily it's ionized in the solar wind.
Are you taking any concepts from your research and putting that into the campaign as a story element or some factor that you've considered?
If we want to talk about how the fiction that I've enjoyed has influenced me and vice versa, that goes way back. Science fiction has definitely influenced what I have wanted to do with my work and my career. It's had a reciprocal effect. I love to inject that back into the things that I create just for fun. So for this, I've taken a couple concepts from theoretical physics, a couple concepts that are embedded in cosmology. I I did the science fiction thing where it's like I took some plausible things and then kind of ran away with it. Some of the things I tried to keep a little realistic, like planet that you guys are on is tidally locked to a red dwarf star. That explains the fact that you guys haven't seen the sun set or rise. It's just been like always on the horizon. Things like asking, hey, what exactly would happen to a planet if its moon were to sort of fall apart and rain down a couple of meteors? How that would affect the terrain, how it would affect the atmosphere when you don't have that body to protect you from external dangers. How do people even deal with that and survive? There's definitely a lot of stretches there. I do like to think about the science when coming up with scientific elements for a story. It doesn't get completely thrown out the window. In science fiction media, I really like it when there's some believable tidbits.
Sounds like we have a good idea about you and the themes that you're bringing into the campaign. Why don't we talk about what Interstitial is as a whole, though? So it is a powered by the Apocalypse engine game that's sort of themed on this concept of taking characters from different worlds. It's very Kingdom Hearts inspired, as I understand it.
Interstitial is a game about relationships and connections. It is all about connecting people to seemingly completely different worlds, different places that they hop to, like you said, very much in a Kingdom Hearts style. It's about making friends, enemies, teachers, and people who cause you to really think about yourself. That's like the bread and butter of it, which struck me the most when first reading about it.
Building this concept from the ground up, now that we have a general idea of what the game is doing, we go to the most hated and beloved question in role-playing books. What the hell is a role-playing game?
That's a very good question. That'd be a very good place to start. I'm not the end-all be-all of who can define what a role-playing game is, but I like to think of it as collaborative storytelling. It's kind of like when we were all younger and we would hang out in recess and we would talk about all of these things that we had imagined. It's like codifying that almost. Saying, hey, you can't just put up a whole bunch of force fields, John, to protect your guy from magic damage. You have to roll to do that, so that there's a chance that you fail. That's what I like to think role-playing games are like.
Yeah, make-believe with rules.
Make-believe with rules is a good way of putting it.
The other thing any given system brings to the table is usually it already presents you with a set of lore or certain topics and themes to go into, and that's where Interstitial itself becomes kind of fun and interesting because it literally encourages you to pull from every genre, every different type of character archetype, and different topics that normally you wouldn't think to put together and sort of smash them into this collage. It's basically the ultimate crossover event.
So now we know a little bit about what a role-playing game is in general. What is unique to Powered by the Apocalypse games, of which Interstitial is one?
Alex, you would probably be the best person to sort of describe that, because I could give my impressions, but it's a very incomplete impression.
The core of Powered by the Apocalypse, you have a 2d6 roll, and there are generally 3 different outcomes from that roll. On a 6 or less, you have a failure. In many games, you get an experience after that failure, as well as consequences. On a 7 to 9, there's some sort of mixed success. Either things don't go quite right, or you have to sacrifice something for things to go your way. And on a 10 plus, you succeed at what you're attempting. There are stats that add to these rolls as modifiers. There's usually no conversion from a stat to a modifier, although there can be depending on the game. There also is the concept of moves, which is just this block of something that your character can either do or roll, similar to features in other games, but they are usually more centrally located. There's usually a couple pages of basic moves that any character can do, and then a playbook that is similar to a character's class and shows how they can expand on what they already know. Finally, the big feature of Powered by the Apocalypse games is a mechanical representation of the connection between characters. Usually, if you act on these or spend them in some way, your character can gain more experience to progress in their playbook.
And in the system, that's represented by our links, of which there are 4 types. light links, which are positive, sort of friendly or romantic, sort of just characters you feel good about, you trust, you like. There are dark links, which are people you dislike, rivals, enemies. Then there's mastery links, which are teachers, or if you're a pupil of somebody. And then heart links are the introspective, that's a relationship that forces you to think a bit more about yourself and maybe reflect a bit more rather than actively learning a new skill or something.
Something that's unique about links as far as representation of connections between characters in Interstitial is that they do not get any farther than those 4 definitions, or at least they do not have to. In many other games, you'll have complete sentences or something to slot these characters' names into. In most Powered by the Apocalypse games, these are one-way representations of how a character feels about another. And that is also the case in Interstitial.
For context, I haven't played any other Powered by the Apocalypse games, but what I do like about this format is that it's not rigid. It sort of leverages scenarios, prompts, in order to allow for certain things to happen. It allows roleplay to be very organic. You're just doing stuff, and then sometimes it will satisfy the conditions to do something kind of specific. The way that it's written is also allows those moves to be very flexible, too. It's very nice.
Yeah, one of the things I very much appreciate about the Apocalypse system is it very rarely forces you to, as a GM or DM, to come up with encounters beforehand. Obviously, you can if you want to, but it's not required to run a successful session of a campaign. You don't have to sit there and go like, oh, I need like 2 orc defenders and a green dragon or whatever. There's not that much number crunching. There's not that much pre-plan. Like, obviously, every DM does their work in pre-planning before they sit down for their session, but it's not so required that you know mathematically like what stats all your players have, and it's a lot less grindy than a lot of systems I've been in.
It's nice because there's no encounter tables. Basically, the only inventory you need to manage is just what your sort of relationships with other people are. You don't have to worry about things like armor classes and stuff like that. It definitely takes the hands off of a lot of that. And as a result, you can have a very wide variety of characters, a very wide variety of power levels, but everyone is still able to play together and not get necessarily outclassed.
We talked a little bit about the types of links there are. Those 4 types of links are also our 4 core stats.
Those link types translate to stats, and those stats with the same names correlate to what your move is like or does. If you use a stat in a certain type of move, it generally is deciding what sort of nature that move is going to result in. Hey, a dark link is typically associated with negative emotions. Well, that's also your attack stat in most cases. There are certain moves that swap those sorts of things, but they're explained by the type of character archetype who's doing it. So a more heroic character will be able to use light instead because they're fighting to defend other people.
So we have quite a few basic moves. We should probably at least go over a little what these do, because we'll probably talk about them throughout the course of the game. I think the most important, probably the most used basic move we'll have is making a link.
Again, the links are the bread and butter of this game. As a result, the process of forming that connection with someone it's quite important. Actually has no less than 3 basic moves that are core to the link process. Of course, you have to make the link with people. In doing that, you do your Powered by the Apocalypse roll with your stat that's related to the type of link that you want to make. You want to make a dark link with someone, you're going to be rolling your dark stat. The outcome is, if you make the link, if you roll good enough, you make the link that you want. There are options where that potentially doesn't happen. There are moves that individual characters can make if their roll to make a link is also high enough. They're called link moves accordingly. If you miss, there's some really bad things that can happen. It forces me to have to think quite a bit because I have to decide if I just can give someone else a link, or I'm told that I could literally make a move as hard as I want, which is a very harsh penalty for a very core process of the game. But links are incredibly valuable, and I think that might be why. you can spend a link, you just remove it from your link list, and you can get advantage on a roll. You get a better chance of succeeding. And this could be used retroactively too. So if your roll was low enough, you can say, oh, I want to spend my link to re-roll that, and then it could change the entire outcome of a scenario. Something that I haven't seen as much being done, but is always out there, is creating small-scale retcons. And then characters still level up in this game. They still gain experience, and you can spend 2 links to get an experience point. Granted, there's only 5 experience points needed to actually take like a new move or level up one of your stats. So making links kind of behooves you anyways, if not just for the fact that you can like upgrade your character faster and stuff like that.
Yeah, your relationships with others in this game is perhaps the most potent source of power, the currency, as it were. Because you can spend and move things around so freely, it really allows you to change your views on characters. So, for example, if I have a dark link with Jimmy, and then I spend that for whatever reason, and then Jimmy does something that super impresses me or apologizes for that encounter that we have, I can make a new light link with Jimmy because, oh, he's nice to me now. Something happened, something changed in that dynamic, and it allows for a lot of flexibility in how your characters look at others around them. You're not set in stone entirely once you make a relationship.
That is sort of signifying character growth in my mind, how your relationships change with other people. And I think this game sort of recognizes that as well. When you go to change your link, which is a third main move revolving around links, you have a chance to lock it. Essentially make it so that the link does not go away. It could just be activated or deactivated. By interacting with characters and by sort of exploring how your character feels around them, you can get this sort of strength through the link system that reflects how deep your character's connections are with other people.
So when you spend or otherwise use a locked link, how does it come back?
So locked links can be activated or deactivated. Unless something bad happens, they don't go away. After you spend a locked link, it becomes deactivated. It's in a particular stat. So let's say you have a light locked link with someone and it becomes deactivated. Well, if you make a roll, any type of move that uses your light stat and you roll a 10 plus, just as a free thing, you can activate that locked link again. Especially by the later stages of a campaign, people will usually have a few locked links, which is pretty significant. And this is kind of going a little bit of ahead, but there is a move called Push Through Stress that covers a lot of scenarios all at once, but you have to roll not with your stats, but you have to roll modifying with how many links you have in a stat category. And locked links, when they're deactivated even, still count for doing that. Again, exploring your character's relationships with other people can make them acting in certain situations more feasible as a sort of reward.
Moving on to some of the other moves, one of the things I enjoy about this system is how simple combat is, because combat for me can get a little bogged down. Not that combat is the focus of this game, but they divide it into 2 parts, strike with intent and strike to subdue, whereas intent is to actually deal harm, sort of defeat the enemy, as it were, whereas subdue is to sort of de-escalate the situation or sort of take control of what's going on.
You don't need a map. You don't need to calculate the trajectories towards other people. And there's actually not a rigid turn order in this system either. It sort of plays through an unspoken fairness rule about when people are actually going, what kind of feels right for the situation that everyone sort of agrees upon. Combat is actually pretty risky for a player character. Obviously, there's quite a few things that you have in your disposal to defend yourself, but unless you are specifically able to choose to defend yourself from harm, for example, when you strike with intent or strike to subdue, you're going to take harm. And I guess now's a good time to mention what that is. Basically, your health bar. Your characters have a total of 4 points in their health clock, as it's called. And if you lose all of those, something really bad happens. It's not necessarily death, but it might as well be close.
Yeah, the one big thing that a GM might actually have to put to paper about their NPC is their personal harm clock, because that's the one thing that really differentiates NPCs if they're going to fight. A mook might have something like a harm clock of 2. Some big bad might have something like 8. So that means that the characters have to smack them about 8 times or do extra damage somehow, extra harm, in order to bring down whatever this thing is.
Yeah, like you said, they don't really have any character sheets or anything like that. They don't have internal stats, they don't get links, but there is a certain level of liberty that, from the game master standpoint, that you have with this party of 6 people is probably going to, if everyone attacks at the same time, deal quite a lot of harm. So is it a group that can, handle a beating, or is it just little tiny guys that absolutely are not able to handle any of this?
We do have one more move that's not strictly combat oriented, but that can deal harm, which is cast magic.
Oh, magic. Magic in this game. If anyone listening is interested in playing Interstitial, I cannot recommend enough to look at and think about what the potential impacts of magic are in this game, because it's buck wild, let's just say. You have a list of 8 options, which, if you have some experience with Powered by the Apocalypse games, I imagine that's definitely above average. Unless you restrict yourself from your character's standpoint, it's technically something anyone can do. Even if your character doesn't know magic, but if they are hacking into something electronically, that can function as magic as well. Magic is basically trying to act as a form of soft wish fulfillment. You can accomplish extraordinary things.
Yeah, it definitely allows you to sort of cross that issue of power scaling when you get into crossover things like this. Like, for example, as you will soon discover, our campaign includes a horse that believes she's a unicorn but is not, and then all the way up to a literal god. There's a broad spectrum of possibilities in what you can accomplish in the system using magic, or choosing to abstain to use magic is also something that certainly shapes your character.
The main crux is that by default, you have to use your mastery stat, which is, again, reflective of how your character is at teaching or learning. For some characters, that is prohibitive. It is nearly impossible to get a good result. But for others, it can be rather easy. There are certain archetypes, certain playbooks in this game that are adept at using the cast magic basic move.
One more move that might be relevant to combat that's basic that everyone gets, called Defend from Harm.
Yeah, that one's basically what you get on the tin. It sort of allows the character to prevent harm to others around them or themselves. That rolls with your light stat because, positive emotion of protecting, defending. You either prevent the danger, sort of expose yourself in the middle and sort of either take some aspect of harm, or the GM does something, or if you completely fail on this act, then the situation escalates and you certainly take harm. It's definitely a risk, but it is certainly not a bad one to take.
Similarly, we have these aiding and interfering sort of moves.
Aiding someone is called Limit Break. You roll with your light stat. If you are successful, you can make someone's roll more likely to succeed. So basically someone's like, I want to try to do this thing. And then someone else in the party is like, oh yeah, I agree. Let me try to help you out by limit break. If it doesn't work out, you either have to spend a link or take a harm, one of your precious 4 points of your harm clock. And if you completely fail, you make the situation worse. One of my favorite phrases for codifying how you miss a limit break. On the other side of the coin, you can hinder someone's action with the move to interfere. You can either do this by explaining it through surprise or by forceful action. You roll with dark. NPCs, they don't really need to roll to do things. So limit breaking doesn't necessarily make sense. You can still work with it. They don't take the stat change that players do. But with interfere, it has a rule set for both player characters and NPCs. Player characters, like we mentioned, for the move push through stress, you can force them to have to do that, or you can try to bribe them with the interfere, in that if they don't do the action that you are trying to hinder, they get an experience, which I think is a very interesting combination. If you roll high enough, you can go with both options. For an NPC, it's just either they don't do it if you're completely successful, they don't do it cleanly. If you miss when trying to interfere, they do what they're trying to do, and the GM gets to make a move as hard as they want. The book literally tells you good luck. These two moves are Some of the stronger moves that can change relationships between characters, if you interfere with someone or limit break with them, that can influence how someone might change their link with you.
You did hit on two mechanics of Powered by the Apocalypse I want to talk about between these two moves, because you mentioned the specific triggers for interfere. So in Powered by the Apocalypse, the moves that usually have some role or some mechanical effect associated with them, you have to have a narrative trigger to occur first. And after that happens, you can say, this is the move I'm starting to do. So that's why interfere has specifically that surprise or force element to stopping someone. Limit break also gives somebody a +1 forward. Forward is a bonus to a roll. It doesn't stack with other forwards. You basically add it to whatever stat you were rolling, and some of them are conditional and will run across those in other basic moves.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe I've heard of Deep Dive in a couple of other games. I believe I listened to a game that I think might have been Apocalypse Engine as well, that had at least a form of Deep Dive. Deep Dive is the investigation tool. You confront the situation and you ask questions. The player is directly asking the GM questions about this situation. What here is not as it seems. How to get out, if it's especially something that's a threat, or identifying what that threat is. And then lastly, identifying what had happened there recently. I definitely like to think of that as like the crime scene investigator type move, the forensic move. For any of these, this rewards you with +1 forward for acting on the answers to those questions. If you miss, the GM gets to tell you something you wish was not true.
That's one of my favorite consequences in the whole game.
I was about to say that. It's really good because they're not lying to you. It's just something you don't want to hear right now.
Especially if a GM is really dialed into a character and they've picked out like an anxiety they can make them focus on instead of what they should be thinking about. Oof, perfect.
It stacks on a problem that they would need to solve or answer. Like in some ways, it can add on more questions. Like, this is exactly the opposite of what I was hoping for. Now, how do I deal with this? It leverages the heart stat, which is all about the introspection, learning without being taught. That really fits for the outcome. In a similar vein, heart is used to convince people to do things. You tell someone what you want from them, you try to get them to do it. This is another thing that has different things, whether it's an NPC or a fellow player character. So for player characters, it's kind of like interfere in that you are definitely manipulating what they're actually able to do, or at least attempting to. So for like player characters, if you roll really good, if they do it, you say they get an experience point. One of the main similarities to interfere is. And if they refuse, they lose a link. If you fail to convince a fellow player character, it tells you to prepare for the worst. For NPCs, on a 10+, they'll do it until something puts them in danger, or if you were trying to connive your way into something, if it reveals your true intentions, that breaks the convincing that you had done. If it's like a mixed success, if it's a 7 through 9, they need assurance or evidence in order to go through. For this type of move, that's kind of my favorite outcome. I like watching players come up with, okay, well, what can we kind of do in order to give them evidence or assurance?
You have to put forward your best bargaining chip, and sometimes that requires a little bit of sacrifice or threats on your end.
So that takes us through all of the basic moves, but let's talk a little bit about what a playbook gives a character.
I like to think of the playbooks as a type of archetype is probably the best word for it. They have your hero characters, your villain characters, your teachers, your friends, the knuckleheaded kind of brute that just kind of charges in. They all have a type of role in the stories that they are generally in. What's nice is that you don't have to have a balance for it. You don't need a dedicated healer. Anyone can technically try to cast magic to heal. With these playbooks, you pick one that has the most moves that you think fit your character, because you're going, whichever playbook you choose, you're going to be using a lot of the moves that are directly available to them. There are a couple, and by that I do mean exactly 2 moves that you can pick from other playbooks of your choosing. But by the time you pick all of your advancements, you're going to have 6 moves off of your main playbooks. It's definitely a big choice that you're kind of investing in. There are some playbooks that have I'll say it's a type of gimmick integral to how that archetype functions. So, hey, are you a fusion between two different entities? Is your existence entirely dependent on others knowing that you exist or having links with you, rather? Those are, for some, one of the moves that you have to start with, and it sort of sets up some of the things that you need to consider for how you play your character. Each playbook has different stats that they start with. You actually have the option of subtracting a point from one of the stats to increase a point in another. So let's say, hey, this character is not quite as good at casting magic because their mastery is a little bit below par. Maybe I can improve that a bit so that I can actually cast some magic.
The range is also somewhere from -1 to +2, which makes sense adding to a 2d6 roll where you're, centering around 7, and 7 is the mixed success. Trying to bump that up to a +3 is about where you'd want to be to regularly not have to even deal with middling success.
Some characters have some, what I will call, extreme stat allocations to start with. It sort of gently pushes you almost subconsciously to do the kind of moves that use those stats because they're the ones that are easiest for you to do. It definitely affects how you're able to move. That's all entirely intentional because that's the type of archetype that you're playing as. In addition to more specialized moves that player characters have with the playbook that they choose, they also have a link move that activates upon a complete success of making a link with someone. Some of the link moves, it's not actually necessary for them to go off when you're going to make a link. They more so trigger when someone else makes a link or something like that. The link move is certainly mutable, and in fact, if you so choose later on, players do have the option of just outright changing what their link move is.
You actually hit on the last thing I wanted to mention about the playbooks, which is after you take 3 advancements, you get a special advancement.
Internally, I love to call this character ascension. For some of them, it changes the game. You get a free move after you've leveled up 3 times. You can either take an advancement that they list in the back of the book, which is available to everyone, or you can take your character-specific advancement exclusive to the type of playbook that you have. Like other people, when they level up, they can pick a move from other playbooks, but your level 3 advancement, that's just for you. This is where your character is really able to come into form.
Yeah, and some of the after effects are kind of nutty once you hit that level. They can completely allow you to use different stats your character ordinarily wouldn't be able to use, or allow certain moves that your archetype generally wouldn't go for. Like, for example, I'm playing a light character, and my 3rd advancement move allows me to cause harm by spending links, and my character probably wouldn't do that very regularly as a light, sort of positive force in their environment. Other characters might be able to ascend to higher level magical skills or manipulate their stats as they see fit for a particular fight.
The players have their moves between the basic moveset and their playbooks. For the GMs, they have some outlines for principles to kind of adhere to, and they have some prompts that they can inject into the campaign that function as their moves. There's no rolling required, but they are able to pick from that moveset in response to what the players are doing. They have some mechanics in there, like giving player characters links or taking them away, but they are more ways to subtly manipulate the situation, like asking a player what they would do in that circumstance or what have you.
Yeah, it definitely allows for a lot more open-endedness than a lot of other role-playing systems would allow, and you can really cater the experience to what your players are choosing to do at that given point in time, too. Alright, so let's get into the resolution phase, the segment of the show where Daniel gets to say something about the game, and nobody gets to comment on it. So Daniel, what do you have to say?
You all are in for a wild ride, and I look forward to having fun every step of the way. You can find me down in the mines. I can't hear you with all that dang drilling.
This has been Resolve, an after-play show. You can find us online at most social media sites at ResolveAP.
Except Instagram, which is at ResolveAfterPlay.
Thank you so much for joining us today. You can buy the game we're playing, Interstitial, Our Hearts Intertwined, from its creator, Riley Hopkins, at linksmithgames.com.
All links will be in the description of this episode.
Thank you again for listening. We end our turn here, so now it's your turn. Tell us about a game you're planning to run.